Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you all for being here. No lines tonight for those of you who were here last night. We have had a great run of recent lectures at the library, recent presentations with Michelle Rhee and David Stockman, and last night Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And we're building up now that Steve Coll is here to an apotheosis. But I hope one of the things I hope everyone understands is that we're presenting a very wide range of political views, a very wide range of thinking about what is important in this country today, and we hope also we're meeting our goal of presenting a lifelong liberal arts education to all of our patrons at the library. One thing I do want to mention, as is usual when we do our events down here in Kirk Hall at the Central Library, is the gates will be open. You don't need to get your tickets validated for the parking, so the gates will be open. We have a number of ongoing series that we have been presenting and will continue to present. And I do want to mention that tomorrow night at the Plaza Library, Cynthia Kerner, who's a professor at George Mason, will be continuing our ongoing series on the First Ladies, Beyond the Gowns. As you know, we've been doing with the Truman Library some wonderful series. We started with Presidential Series, which will be ongoing. We now have Beyond the Gowns, and Cynthia Kerner will be talking about Martha Jefferson Randolph, a unique First Lady because she was Jefferson's daughter. Her mother, of course, had died some years before the presidency, and she served as the First Lady. And was also a great example of Jefferson's interest in education, including education for women. This should be a very interesting lecture. We also have another ongoing series that was inaugurated last night, fittingly, by a Justice of the United States Supreme Court, retired, Sandra Day O'Connor, that we're calling Legal Landmarks, also with the Truman Library and a number of other partners, including Stinson Mag, the law firm. Sorry, Stinson, Morrison, Hecker these days. Last night, of course, Justice O'Connor talked about her career on the court and also talked about some interesting justices, Justice Douglas from the left, Justice McReynolds from the very, very, very far right. It was fascinating. What we have upcoming in our Legal Landmarks series, we have Earl Maltz, who will be talking, who's written a book on the subject, will be talking about Dred Scott and the politics of slavery as we commemorate, celebrate's probably too large a word, commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. I think that's a good one to have. A couple of other programs I want to mention. Upcoming. On Tuesday, June 11th, next Tuesday, a week from today, we'll have Jay Nordlinger, who is an editor and is a columnist and editor at National Review, talking about the Nobel Prize. He's written a book called Peace, They Say, about the history of the Nobel Peace Prize. A fascinating book. Jay is a wonderful writer, and I'd urge you to take a look at that. And a couple of other things I'll mention. In our Beyond the Gowns series, we have John Robert Green talking about Betty Ford. And then on Wednesday, June 12th, a week from tomorrow, we have the third time he's been in the library, Zachary Karabell, who's a wonderful popular historian, and this is his second book on the U.S. and China. The good news is the bad news is wrong about U.S.-China relations. And again, if you're interested in the country that will own this country about 30 years from now, owns about half of it now, you might want to come and hear that. That'll be here at the Central Library a week from Wednesday. But now it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Steve Coll, who has written a number of wonderful books. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, first Pulitzer Prize for a series on the Securities and Exchange Commission, second Pulitzer Prize for his book Ghost Wars about Afghanistan, which is for sale from our friends at Reading Reptile around the corner. And I think after the talk, he'll be happy to sign your copies. He's had a very distinguished career as a Washington Post writer and editor. He was managing editor at the Washington Post. He's recently retired as the president, the second president of what I thought was that mythical beast, a centrist think tank, the New Americas Foundation. He is, in addition to his book, Ghost Wars, which won the Pulitzer Prize. He's also written a book on bin Laden, Osama bin Laden and his family. It did not win a prize because he failed to take my advice about the title. I told him it's called the bin Ladens, an Arabian family. I suggested to him that he should call it Osama and his mama. And because of that, it's the one of his books that has not won a major prize. His latest book, which has won, was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and is one of the best looks, if not the best look, at a major American corporation in our time, private empire, about ExxonMobil. I listened to him. I think it was on NPR a while ago, and talked to Henry about it and said we have to get Steve Coll here to talk about this book. It is a brilliant look at ExxonMobil, the largest corporation, at least in terms of profitability. They vie with Microsoft or Google from time to time in stock valuation and other things. But they make a lot more money than anybody else. They are truly international. In fact, so international, he quotes Lee Raymond, the CEO, who retired in the mid-2000s, and who made the contemporary ExxonMobil, as saying it wasn't really an American company, it was really an international company. And in a way, he wasn't even an American citizen, he was an international citizen. Translation of that is, of course, the shareholders are the people that he answered to, and not to the government of this country. So one time I've enjoyed thinking about Ralph Nader, who I think went to one of their and a number of other corporate annual meetings, asking them if they wouldn't do the Pledge of Allegiance at the annual meeting, and they refused. It's a brilliant book. It is a tough empirical look. It is not entirely negative about ExxonMobil, and it's got an amazing array of characters, American characters, diplomats, and members of the Clinton and Bush administration, and the modern contemporary dictators, from African and Indonesian dictators to Russian, to Vladimir Putin and Khodorkovsky and the others. And I can't recommend it more highly as a look at the way the world actually works today. And he has just been made, his next job starting July 1, he's just been made the dean of the second most important school of journalism in the United States, the Columbia Journalism School, the other Columbia, that is the one in New York, as opposed to the Columbia University of Missouri School of Journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Coll.
Thank you, Crosby, very much. Thank you all for coming out. Nice to see this crowd. That last joke provokes me into saying that I was really glad to be back in Missouri, and I was in St. Louis last night, and I was reminded what Missouri is made of in terms of its competitive spirit, because I was at the county library, and I was walking out to the car with the guy who had been my gracious host afterwards, and he remarked, as you'd expect a director of a library to say, he said, by the way, we are the largest library system in the state of Missouri. And then he paused and he said, and that would include the system in Kansas City where you're going tomorrow. But I have to concede this is a much nicer building, and you're a larger crowd, so there you go. Well, I don't want to talk beyond my allotted time or yours. I notice there's an imbalance in the audience leaning toward the exit, so I want to make sure that I finish on time. But I want to give you a flavor of this project, 4 years of my life, the hardest book I've ever worked on, 400 interviews, the most difficult subject I think I've ever taken on. I did it sort of inadvertently. My last 3 book projects, each of them about a 4-year project in one way or another, have been to do complex reporting about the CIA, the bin Laden family, and then ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil was, by an order of magnitude or 2, the hardest of those 3 institutions to kind of break down and understand, the most closed, the most disciplined, and the toughest for a reporter. It certainly made me better as a journalist working on the project. But I wanted just to first give you a sense of where this book came from. I finished up this work in Saudi Arabia on the bin Ladens, and I really wanted to write a book about oil and energy in our national life, in our global life, and to update a book that I had admired in college very much, probably some of you have read, called The Prize by Daniel Yergin, which is really a book about oil and power in the post-war world and in an era of discovery and expansion, expansion of American power, expansion of the global economy, expansion of the energy economy. It was a journey of discovery in a lot of ways, published in a timely period during the oil shocks of the 1970s. And I thought it was time to write a book like The Prize, but in this era of limits, contestation, inequality, public debate about climate change, and the risks and benefits of our oil economy as it moves into more and more high-risk environments or deals, comes back onshore in the United States and North America through the unconventional exploitation of natural gas, and just try to update the sort of dynamics that the prize tried to describe. And I went out into the world to work on that without choosing ExxonMobil initially as my subject. I got out about 6 or 7 months into the research. And I thought, in the way that a writer is constantly thinking about what is the story and where am I beginning and where am I ending, and I just felt adrift and without an adequate subject matter. And so I thought I should choose a single company to focus on, to bring all of these themes together and to focus my own reporting. And so when I looked at my choices, I thought, well, really ExxonMobil was the natural choice, the largest corporation headquartered in the United States by many measures for many years, sometimes competing with Apple for stock market valuation, sometimes competing with Walmart for raw revenues. But if you go back and look at the Fortune 500 lists in the 1950s, there it is, its predecessor company, Esso, or Humble Oil. And they're on the list in the top 5 every year, a testimony to the durable profitability and power of oil in our economy over all these years. And those lists make you tear up a little bit about how this country has changed and what it's lost over those 50 or 60 years. U.S. Steel is on the list, #1 proudly in the 1950s, and General Motors and Ford. Country's changed a lot, but ExxonMobil's still there. And that interested me. It's also a very closed system, a company that really doesn't receive much scrutiny, considering that its revenues are now about $450 billion a year, give or take. That's more than the economic activity of most countries in the world if you compare it to GDP. If it were a country, it'd be about the size of Norway. And yet, in comparison to our understanding what journalists do about concentrated power in government, how many journalists are knocking on the White House's door in some metaphorical way, or trying to get underneath the surface of decisions at the Pentagon or at the Central Intelligence Agency. Our democracy is built to scrutinize concentrated power when it resides in the public sphere, but it is less equipped to cope with concentrated power in the private sphere. And that just attracted me as a reporter to this project, because ExxonMobil, whether you judge it to be good, ill, or indifferent, is a source of extraordinary concentrated power in our political economy. And as I say, I went to look on the shelf for all of the pieces of journalism and reporting in depth and serious degrees that I could rely on as I started, and there really wasn't anything. And the whole 4 years that I was working on this project, there was nobody in my side view mirror as a reporter, and sometimes I wondered what I was doing out on the highway myself. But to give you a flavor of what this book tries to describe and what it's about, I'm going to start with a story which the book starts with, because I didn't want to write about ExxonMobil across all of the 20th century. I wanted to write about the world we're in, the world we've been in since the end of the Cold War. That was the kind of starting point that I had. And as it happened, March 23, 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall fell, was a seminal day in the life of ExxonMobil. And it's a story that takes place in Valdez, Alaska, in the Prince William Sound. I don't know, how many of you have been to the Prince William Sound in Alaska? Well, tell your neighbors, it's an American treasure. You should really get up there before you're done. I had not been there until I went there to do this research. And I had no idea that in the United States there was this inland sea teeming with such wildlife, sea lions and seals and bald eagles and schools of salmon and migratory halibut, and just an extraordinary place. It's also the terminus for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline that pumps the oil from the north slope of Alaska to the Valdez port, where supertankers and tankers come in, pick it up, bring it out to global markets. So they pass through this extraordinary, pristine inland sea, as I mentioned. And on that night, March 23, 1989, the Exxon Valdez was docked at the terminal. It had been loaded, and its captain, a man named Joseph Hazelwood, boarded the ship a little around 9 o'clock after having 2 or 3 vodkas, as he later recalled it, at the Pipeline Club bar in Valdez. Now, that night, as the ship pulled away from the dock and headed into the Prince William Sound, Joseph Hazelwood was in command. He'd been a tanker captain for more than a decade. It's 1989. His salary was $100,000 a year, pretty good money in those days, as today. And he was nonetheless suffering from what he called a midlife crisis. He felt that he was in a sort of descent that he couldn't describe. He certainly had a pattern of very heavy drinking. He was drinking 4 or 5 doubles of alcohol before dinner, then wine with the meal, and 3 or 4 drinks afterwards. But he said that he never felt much affected by that level of alcohol intake. He had 2 or 3 DUIs. He'd lost his license to drive a car. Exxon said later that they were monitoring his alcohol intake because in part of an incident where he'd been heard ordering beer over a ship's radio. But they hadn't done anything about it. So off he goes into the darkness, heading towards the Pacific. Now, some of you may know about the shipping industry. I had to learn about it. It's a fascinating portrait of how these giant supertankers move through an area like the Prince William Sound, but it's fairly simple. They drive on the right. Shipping lanes marked outbound and inbound. And that evening, the Valdez moved into the outbound lane, and visible on a clear night ahead was the tip of an iceberg bobbing in the sea. Not at all unusual in March, the Columbia Glacier disgorges these icebergs, and there was a standard procedure if one was encountered, which was to basically cut over into the oncoming traffic lane, go around the iceberg, and then cut back to the outbound lane, assuming, that is, that there were no ships coming the other way. So the Hazelwood radioed to the Coast Guard, determined that the inbound lane was clear, announced his intention to execute this procedure, and then turned to his colleagues, his mates on the bridge, and said, "Do you feel comfortable doing this?" They had done it many times before. And they said, "Sure, boss, we can handle this." He said, "I've got some paperwork to do." He went actually down to his cabin, closed the door. What actually happened next, in his absence, among his experienced but pressured and overworked crew, probably will never be understood entirely. But they became confused, the way pilots can become confused in fog about their bearings. And the next thing that happened was the sound of the hull of the Valdez running aground on Bly Reef, and the metal hull being ripped open, terrible screeching sound that echoed through the whole ship. And the first mate ran down the stairs to Hazelwood's door and knocked on it and said, "Vessel aground, we are in," he said some very dramatic words that I won't repeat here in this august building. And Hazelwood came out and he ran up the stairs and he went into the toilet and he vomited. And then he came out and he smelled the oil rising from the sea pouring into the Prince William Sound. And he said that he said to himself, he said later that he said to himself, I knew then that my life would never be the same. And the same was true for ExxonMobil. That event, the Valdez, caused a kind of revolution in ExxonMobil's affairs over the next 5 or so years. Now, ExxonMobil is a descendant of Standard Oil, the great oil monopoly and trust created by John D. Rockefeller and broken up by order of the Supreme Court on antitrust grounds in 1911. In the centuries since, ExxonMobil has adhered most closely to the culture that John D. Rockefeller created, one of extraordinary principle, moral principle, but also extraordinarily ruthless business practices accompanied by great efficiencies and discipline. Rockefeller built the Standard Oil Trust by an ardent belief that monopoly was the most efficient form of organizing the economy, and yet at the same time he was a man of deep Christian principle and rectitude, and he infused the organization with his moral outlook, even while he engaged in these business practices that the United States Supreme Court judged eventually to be illegal. And ExxonMobil has always been the closest to Standard Oil, but the Valdez showed that it had gotten away from the aspirations of Rockefeller for the world's most efficient and the most reliable company. Because as the story I told suggests, the absence of Hazelwood from the deck when the Valdez wreck occurred offers a clue to our own understanding of that kind of big moment in American environmental history, which is that the drunk driving metaphor we've all inherited is too simple. It's probably not even right. It's not clear that Hazelwood's personal troubles actually had anything to do with the wreck, other than the fact that he violated Exxon's rules by leaving the bridge at such a moment. But his crew was perfectly capable and thought they were capable of executing the maneuver without him. What really was going on was something that's still with us and I think is worth trying to reflect on, which is a failure of systems and a failure of risk management and a failure of regulation and a failure of self-regulation by Exxon. In the 10 years before the Valdez wreck, Exxon had cut its employees from 180,000 to 100,000, 80,000 jobs in 10 years. Now, falling global oil prices had created a shock to an overbuilt company. They had to restructure. But any of you who've worked in an institution know that if you cut the workforce by 40% in 10 years, you're inviting chaos. They cut their safety departments, they cut their environmental compliance departments, the crews were overworked. That was certainly a factor in the accident and in the inability of the crew to manage the job that Hazelwood gave them, or the ability of Exxon to keep track of Hazelwood's problems. At the same time, it wasn't only Exxon that failed that night. The Coast Guard was supposed to have radar that could see what happened when a ship like the Valdez made that turn into the incoming lane. What happened was it crossed over that lane when the crew lost their bearings and ran onto a very well-marked, well-known reef. Now, the Coast Guard never saw this because during the 1980s, in a wave of deregulation, their budgets had been cut, and they no longer had the capacity to see as far into the Prince William Sound as they were supposed to be able to see. Even if they'd had that equipment, the culture at the Coast Guard at this particular time was such that the officers on duty, one of them, the one who would have been watching the radar that didn't exist, was not at his station because it was later testified that he was off smoking marijuana that night. So basically you had a catastrophic failure of the type that we often see when things melt down. And I want to just mark that, because when we think about ExxonMobil's place in our political economy and our environment and the risks that it has to manage and that it manages on behalf of the rest of us, since we're sort of co-owners of the public spaces that are at risk when an oil tanker goes through the Prince William Sound, I want to just mark this idea that the Valdez and its aftermath, like the Deepwater Horizon incident, more recently, is not about a single person or a single human failing. It's about risk management and systems. So what happened to ExxonMobil after the Valdez? Well, a young man was rising, not so young, an executive was rising at ExxonMobil named Lee Raymond. His toughness was legendary inside the corporation. ExxonMobil is a place where people come young and stay for life. It's like the Marine Corps. You don't come to the top ranks of ExxonMobil from other industries where you've had success. Being a great marketing executive at Pepsi or IBM is no ticket to the top at ExxonMobil. People rise in cadres through the ranks. They're vetted 5 to 7 years. People either stay for life or go, generally speaking. And the executives are all insiders. And there was a very strong military influence culture. Lee Raymond, who was not a veteran, was tougher than the next guy. His nickname was, and here I will sully these great halls, Iron Ass. That's what he was known around the office. And that reflected the fact that he was a very intimidating character who it could be generously said, did not suffer fools. He really was a bruising man in some respects. He could be quite pleasant and reticent in private settings, but in his public persona and his leadership persona, he felt that after the Valdez, ExxonMobil needed a transformational leader who was intent on a new era of discipline and perfectionism. This is a company that's always been led by engineers, and I think one of the motivating forces inside after the Valdez was never again. We're going to wring human fallibility out of our daily operations. And so Raymond and others oversaw the implementation of a series of extraordinary safety, environmental, financial compliance, and rules that took what was already a company loyal to John D. Rockefeller's principled and disciplined vision and took it to extremes. There was a new drug and alcohol testing regime, of course, where nobody could drive a truck or a tanker again without being regularly tested. But this extended to basically eliminating all accidents and all safety violations from the workforce record. And the way this was done was to empower managers and employees to basically self-report on all accidents. So if we were at an ExxonMobil meeting, I would already have started by giving you a safety briefing before I delivered my talk. I would have pointed out that the exit is over there and that there's another exit behind you and that if there's an emergency, please walk to them. Your cars outside would all be parked back into the spaces so that you could get into them and see out as you drove and wouldn't run into anybody else or any other cars. You would have probably spent the day before you came to this meeting in small group meetings talking about recent safety performance in your group. At ExxonMobil, paper cuts are a reportable accident. At ExxonMobil, leaving a file drawer open will draw a written reprimand because someone could strike their knee on it. The ultimate metric is days lost to injury. And so your conduct outside the workplace is equally relevant. And there is a kind of a 12-step-like meeting culture where people talk about near misses that they've had, both at the workplace, but then also at home. And when I did some random interviewing with ExxonMobil employees and managers at different places by just calling around, cold calling former employees and current employees that I'd found by looking at actually campaign contribution records, I'll tell that story as just a piece of reporting later, but anyway, they would say that many of them were very happy, long-time employees, 20, 30-year records. They had secure retirements, one of the last corporations in America where you could work for life, retire well. And then in general, inside the rules bubble, if you could adapt to the rules, it was, according to them, often a happy place to work. But you did have to put up with all of these safety meetings. And more than one of the people I talked to said, you know, the only real anxiety I had over the years was coming up with something new to say at the safety confessionals, because it was always the same group of 4 or 5 people you worked with, and yet you were constantly being called up to give the blessing, as it were, and you had to come up with a new story. So people would talk about how they had just gone on vacation for 2 weeks and they really had not used sunscreen at the lake. They had been operating a lawnmower somewhat aggressively, and a rock had come out and struck them on the leg and bruised them. People would report basically bruising themselves in a softball game on the weekend. But this was part of a larger objective, and it started to take. ExxonMobil today has the finest safety performance record for workers, the lowest rate of worker injury at refineries and complex working environments. If you had a relative who was working on an offshore platform, you'd want them to work at an ExxonMobil supervised contractor, much more likely to come home in one piece. You look at the OSHA safety inspections that preceded some of the accidents at BP's plant in Texas City that killed 8 or 9 workers, if I'm somewhere in that ballpark. And you look around at all the record of BP-operated facilities in the United States, and the OSHA inspections are just damning, one after another, hundreds, scores of violations. But what's most remarkable is, well, what's the benchmark? Literally, in ExxonMobil's case, it can be 0 over a period of years. They are compliant fanatics. But what happened to their culture was that this engineering, metrics-driven, risk reduction culture extended to basically everything that they did. It was a one-size-fits-all strategy for global operations. So the same strategies that they would apply in Houston, they would apply in Chad and in Indonesia. And so a dilemma rose up, and this is at the heart of the book. If you, I'm sure you listen to lots of different interesting speakers here and probably a lot of fiction writers. And you remember from your high school English class, at least as I do, my high school English teacher, always very influential. They would go to the blackboard the first day in high school English and they say, okay, what's the structure of a novel? Well, the novel is about a protagonist who faces a dilemma, right? They go across a landscape. So they have some problem. You have a hero or a protagonist. They go across the landscape and then they come into conflict with the dilemma, and then the dilemma is resolved. Well, as I was getting ready to write Private Empire and thinking of ExxonMobil as my protagonist and thinking of this Valdez generated reformation and the culture of risk management that had grown up, I thought, aha, this is at the heart of what ExxonMobil is today. The world's most risk-averse corporation, or certainly one of them, certainly the most determined to manage risk, whose business is inexorably, day by day, driving it into greater and greater risk environments. Risks involving politics, risks involving unstable countries in Africa and Asia, risks involving the environment, risks involving political resistance to fracking. There is a change afoot in our oil industry that has taken ExxonMobil's desire to wring all human fallibility and all political risk out of their daily operations and pitted it against the inexorable fact that the oil industry is getting riskier and riskier and riskier. Now, why is that so? Let me try to give you a taste of it in just 5 minutes. So in the 1970s, in the 1960s, let's say, to keep it cleaner, in the 1960s, Exxon's predecessor company owned so much oil in the world, oil and gas, that they really didn't even bother to count how much they owned. The reason was that, like the other 7 sisters, the other big oil companies of the Anglo-American world, they owned a piece of Saudi Arabia's Aramco oil reserves. They owned a piece of Iraq's national oil company. They owned a piece of Iran's national oil company. The big, endless pools of safe, seemed safe, easy to produce, sweet, close to ocean waters oil. And there was so much of it that if you owned a share of Exxon in those days, it really wasn't relevant how deep the pool was. There was just a lot of it, and it was a question of how much you could produce and market. That changed in the 1970s with the rise of what I think academic political scientists have come to call resource nationalism. In the 1970s, post-colonial societies in the Arab world and many other places decided that oil was different from other goods in their societies. They should not be owned by Western corporations. That ownership was a national right, a right of citizens. And so they began to expropriate the property rights and to expel the corporations that included Exxon. In the early 1970s, ExxonMobil was producing 7.5 million barrels of oil and gas, the oil equivalent oil and gas, around the world every day. 7.5 million barrels. Today, they produce about 4.5. That decline is a function of the fact that they have been deprived access to the great pools of oil in the Middle East. Resource nationalism spread for a lot of reasons around Latin America, around Asia, and a lot of post-colonial societies adopted this view that they should build their own national oil companies and own 100% of the oil under their sovereign territory. So that left ExxonMobil with a dilemma. If you couldn't own oil in the big proven pools of the Middle East, where could you find it? Well, in North America, Europe, and Australia, in our free market systems, property rights prevail. Anyone can own anything that they can buy legally under contract. And that would seem to offer an alternative strategy. But oil production in the West, broadly defined, had been in decline, really, for some time. And in the United States, there was no new finds to offset the loss of this Middle Eastern oil. That left ExxonMobil with a dilemma that I discovered by traveling early during this research to a country I'm betting no one here has been to, called Chad. Anybody been to Chad? Okay, so Chad is a very poor country in West Central Africa, and very large in expanse, 11 million people, but quite a benighted place. And I lived in South Asia for a few years, and I've worked in most places, and I've seen a lot of difficult environments. But when I got to Chad, I thought, this really is a benighted place. It's at the very bottom of the Human Development Indexes that the UN publishes. Life expectancy for men is about 45 years. The rates of maternal and child mortality are just about the highest, and the top 2 or 3 on Earth. And it's been ravaged by small wars and guerrilla movements and revolutions of various types, but it's been controlled by an authoritarian leader, I think the State Department prefers to call them now, named Idris Deby. And Chad has long known it had oil, but it was only when Exxon came in the post-Cold War period that they started to actually develop it in their southern fields, and the World Bank financed a pipeline across Cameroon to get the oil out to market. And I traveled over there early on. I made a map of the world, according to ExxonMobil, after I chose to write a book about them. I called them up and said, congratulations, I've decided to write a book about you. Then I really didn't know what I was getting into. I came to understand that, journalists to ExxonMobil are sort of like what happens on your windshield when you're driving down the highway. But I was naive at that stage of the project, and so I said, well, I'm going off to research your place in the world, all over the world. I'd like to visit some of your facilities. And they said, thank you. We'll get back to you. So I went to Chad anyway, and I drove down into the southern areas and out into the countryside and looked at some of the places where their oil was being produced and saw their facilities and interviewed as many different kinds of people as I could find. And at a certain point along the journey, it was a fascinating trip, but I one of those Sherlock moments, yeah, of course. I found myself driving back towards N'Djamena and asking, why are they here? I mean, why would ExxonMobil, the largest corporation headquartered in the United States, come to Chad? I mean, the oil is of very poor quality. The distance to market is very great. The degree of political instability is almost immeasurable, because in such a poor society endowed with oil, the capital, the presidential palace, becomes like a bank waiting to be robbed by the next coup maker or the next guerrilla force. And this was particularly vivid in another country I visited nearby, Equatorial Guinea, where ExxonMobil is also present and very active. Literally bands of pirates and coup makers and guerrillas arrive on the shore of the capital of Malabo in speedboats armed with weapons and charge towards the presidential palace. Because if you can capture power and rewrite the oil contracts, you can put $30 million into a Swiss bank account the next day. So you're almost inducing kind of a political turmoil in order to capture the hill. So I thought, why are they here? Well, the answer goes back to what I was saying about the loss of access to easy oil in the world. They had to be there. They had to be there because they needed to replace the reserves that they pump out and sell every day, and there just aren't that many places in the world where they can own oil and gas anymore. 4.5 million barrels a day, okay, much reduced from the early 1970s, but still multiply it by 365 days, and you get a couple of $3 billion barrels of oil every year that goes out the door, sold for cash, cash comes in, give it to the shareholders, but that oil has to be replaced. Because unlike the 1960s, now the stockholders of ExxonMobil do care how much oil and gas it owns. Every year, these companies report to Wall Street what their proven reserves are. And in order to keep the impression available to investors, stockholders, and others that they're not shrinking into oblivion, they like to report that they have replaced at least as much as they pumped out and sold. That means you have to book onto your reserves 2 or 3 billion barrels of oil every year. Now, any of you in the business know that's not easy to find, even if you're having a good day at the office. So every discovery, every opportunity in a place like Chad matters. Now, why doesn't Chad ascribe to the same resource nationalism that Saudi Arabia did, or Iraq did, or Iran did after the revolution when they threw ExxonMobil out? The reason is simple. They're too weak to do otherwise. These weak states don't have the national capacity to produce their own oil. They don't have the population with the specialized skills. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the resources. And so they have no choice. If they want the money, they have to invite ExxonMobil in and let ExxonMobil own the oil. So here's a company that is built on risk management and risk aversion after Valdez, being driven by its own business model into one weak state after another. Exxon bought Mobil in 2000, and before that, Exxon, the pre-ExxonMobil Exxon, had been not so much involved in these adventurous frontier regions of oil production around the world. They were well regarded for their financial management, for their capital discipline, for some of the operating strengths that I mentioned, their project management, but they were not known in the industry for their spirit of discovery of new oil fields. But Mobil was. And so when they bought Mobil, they bought a bunch of properties in places like Equatorial Guinea and Nigeria and Indonesia. And then with those properties, they bought a bunch of wars, essentially. They bought 3 or 4 small wars. Now, I don't think their investment bankers advised them that when they were buying Mobil, they were also buying 3 or 4 wars, but they did have to learn to manage the kind of instability and turmoil that these places produced. Now, I said that this protagonist and its dilemma was about a risk-averse company dealing with a world of risk inexorably built into its business. Political risk in these turbulent countries is one form of that. But I also mentioned that it was true in an environmental or an operating sense. So think about the Deepwater Horizon. BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, out drilling in frontier depths of water, 5,000 feet or more, where essentially, as in the early days of aviation, great engineers, great teams are trying to solve problems that nobody has quite solved before. ExxonMobil drills in the Arctic, in offshore of Siberia, Salakan Island, where it's drilled horizontally under an Arctic Sea. It's promising now to go north of the Arctic Circle with Russia's Rosneft company and drill in Arctic summer seas where the ice is melting because, by the way, of global warming, where oil was not accessible before. And you could ask the same question when you look at these non-political risk environments. Why are they there? Why are they there? Why would you go out and try to drill a hole in 10,000 feet of water when nobody does that routinely? Well, the answer is they need every barrel of oil they can produce for the same reasons that I described in reference to Chad. Now, the biggest story in ExxonMobil's life today is visible in this part of the country, which is with the explosion of fracking and unconventional gas discoveries in the United States, it's been possible for ExxonMobil to trade the political risk of West Africa for the political risk of Hollywood movie makers making films about fracking in the United States. Essentially, here finally is a growth story in the land of property rights in the oil and gas industry. The explosion of unconventional oil and gas production is an invitation to ExxonMobil to come back home, but also a new form of this dilemma, because at least in some parts of the country, there's an enormous amount of resistance, concern, and political organizing to try to prevent some of this unconventional oil and gas production from going forward. ExxonMobil in Chad and in the Marcellus of western Pennsylvania is not the world's most successful political animal. They don't communicate very well, as I discovered along the way, and they don't really have a political strategy that is supple and adaptable to the kinds of circumstances that they now face. Now, I want to sort of finish my part of this by just talking a little bit about what ExxonMobil is. What is the nature of the power that it exercises while it deals with these dilemmas that I've described? And Crosby touched on it when he mentioned that Lee Raymond had once said in a meeting in Washington that he didn't really think of himself as a U.S. company. You could say that about a lot of multinational corporations. You could say that about Google or Apple or other companies. But ExxonMobil's position is different because its business model is different. Essentially, its business is to drill holes in the ground and sit on top of them for 40 years at a time and take value out of them. So they need a world that is stable and friendly to 40-year projects that are drilled in the ground. Now, that means that their political strategy is worldwide, aimed at creating a world that is stable, friendly to oil production, and friendly to the rule of law and contracts, because in order to reap the value of a 40-year project, you need a stable contract across those 40 years. So when people ask, what is ExxonMobil's strategy in Washington, D.C., where they spend an enormous amount of money on lobbying? Well, a lot of it is to outlast the U.S. government as much as it is to manipulate it. Lee Raymond said to me at one point, we see presidents come and go. Well, 40 years under our Constitution, I hope so, but there is a kind of a sense of the long run. But what that reflects is something that I started out, when I looked at my map and first started to travel, I thought, this looks like a country to me, an empire, a sovereign state, a sovereign independent of all governments. And I thought, well, maybe that's a little cheeky to impose that view on ExxonMobil. And when I started to interview current and former executives, I came to understand, no, actually, that's the way they see themselves. They do see themselves as not subordinate to any government, but parallel to governments. Lee Raymond traveled the world in a fleet of private corporate aircraft, and he met with his counterparts when he arrived in a place like Russia, and he considered his counterpart to be Vladimir Putin. There's a kind of a fascinating story in the book where he's trying to buy, Crosby mentioned, Yukos, which was owned by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's now in prison. He was then one of the great oil barons of Russia, and his company, Yukos, he wanted to sell in order to get out of Putin's way, essentially. And ExxonMobil was negotiating to buy a share of the company. And what was at issue was whether ExxonMobil could buy a controlling share of 51%. And Lee Raymond told Mikhail Khodorkovsky, I've got to have 51%. Khodorkovsky said, I don't think Putin's going to let me sell 51%. This is a big national oil company. He's not going to want to let you have a controlling interest. Well, Putin said, well, I'll meet with Putin. I'll talk to him about it directly. Khodorkovsky said, that doesn't sound like a great idea to me, but I can't control Lee Raymond. So Raymond arranged a private meeting with Putin at the New York Stock Exchange. And they sat down together for a couple of hours, and there's a pretty detailed account of it in the book that I know to be reliable. And in the course of the conversation, which was wide-ranging and very interesting, Putin finally says, look, I understand you want to buy 51% of this company, but are you telling me that if you own 51% of the company and I want to do anything at Yukos, I want to change a director, I want to change an employee, I want to direct political contributions, I have to come to you to talk about it? And Raymond said, yeah, but that's not so bad. It's like that in a lot of places in the world. 6 weeks later, Putin arrested Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and he's been in prison ever since. The deal never went through. The other thing, though, to understand about the sovereignty in an American context is that it lives in defiance of our own state in an interesting way. You know, every industrialized democracy in the West has produced, because of the way oil works in our economy and the way our energy economy is organized, every industrial democracy in the West has produced a big national oil company. There's Eni in Italy, there's Total in France, there's BP in Britain. Shell's kind of a weird Anglo-Dutch example. And in the United States, ExxonMobil is the one we have after the Standard Oil breakup. It's our national oil company. But you know, if you go look at the sort of anthropology of a place like Total, the people who run Total and the people who run the French government, they all went to school together, probably from high school on. Their sense of the uniformity of the interests of the company and the state, very difficult to draw a line down that equation. In Britain, BP was owned by the British government as recently as the 1980s. But here's ExxonMobil, headquartered in Irving, Texas. And its chief executive today, Rex Tillerson, Lee Raymond's successor, recently told a magazine that his favorite book is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Now, so how is it that only in the United States do we produce basically a national utility company that is built on the essential and seemingly inexorable and unchangeable role of oil and gasoline in our transportation economy? And it was essentially a kind of embedded in our political economy as the electricity companies that are regulated, at least notionally, in the public interest and turn the lights on in this building, could be run by a management team that regards concentrated power with the sort of suspicion that Atlas Shrugged describes. And without any great sense of irony that I'm aware of, sitting on a platform of concentrated power that is pretty formidable in its own right. You know, we listen to our politicians talk about our energy policy, our national energy policy during campaign seasons, and every 4 years they pledge to free us from Middle East oil and come up with a better energy policy that will be good for all Americans. And then they're elected and they write a few white papers and they appoint somebody interesting and powerless at the Department of Energy, and that person realizes it's pretty much the worst job in Washington and resigns after 2 or 3 years. And you ask, well, then what is our energy policy? Well, I think it was encapsulated, it is ExxonMobil. They're much more formidable, durable. They have a clear plan, a 40-year vision, the resources to pursue their strategy, the discipline to execute the strategy, and a long-term goal that is far more sort of easy to describe than anything an American president has yet described. And one version of it was described by Lee Raymond when he was talking about BP's alternative energy strategy, all those suns, green and yellow suns that he used to mock, as if BP is not really an oil and gas company. That's all just marketing, he said. You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to emblazon on the granite outside our headquarters, right where everyone walks in every morning, I want to emblazon the words crude oil, just so nobody is under any mistake under what business we're in. Thank you for listening. I appreciate your time.